Well, I suppose if you feel you got it, you got it.
Yeah.
You like to dance?
More than anything in the world.
You want to work with me?
Yes, Mr. Gable.
Shake.
Yes, sir.
Now beat it.
Thank you.
That's where each and every little bell. I was very drunk and quite swept off my feet by your charm.
There was a time when Clark Gable was everywhere. You walked into a theater and saw his face. You opened a newspaper and saw his name. You looked to Hollywood and Clark Gable stood at the very top. Clark Gable did not just have fame. He had power, the backing of the biggest studios, and a future that seemed brilliantly bright. But in 1942, everything changed direction. An accident took away the woman he loved most, and then war pulled him away from the spotlight. The name Clark Gable returned, but no longer with glory, instead with loss. Broken marriages, family secrets, and a weary heart. From a silver screen icon, Clark Gable slid into scandals of his own making. So what really happened to Clark Gable? Are you ready? Because what I'm about to reveal about the tragedy of one of the world's most charming leading men will leave you stunned. Poor childhood lacking warmth. His full name was William Clark Gable, born on March 1st, 1901 in Cadiz, Ohio. Clark Gable's mother was very frail, and doctors advised her not to have children, but driven by the desire to become a mother, she gave birth to Clark Gable and passed away before he was even 1 year old. Because of conflicts caused by religious differences between the two families, his paternal family refused to raise him. So the boy lived with his maternal grandparents until he turned 3. When his father remarried, he brought his unfortunate son back home. Life compensated Gable with a stepmother who loved him like her own child. She taught Clark to play many musical instruments. At 17, Gable discovered his love for acting and joined a traveling theater troupe as an apprentice. However, to earn money for his passion, he had to work 2 years in oil fields with his father to save enough to join a theater group. But unfortunately, the troupe quickly went bankrupt, leaving Clark and others stranded in Butte, Montana. Clark Gable's dreams seemed to end when the troupe moved on and refused to take him along. He continued searching for work in a second-rate theater, but eventually gave up and took a job as a salesman in a grocery store. There, Clark met actress Laura Hope Cruz, who encouraged him to return to the stage. Clark joined a theater in Portland, Oregon, where he received dedicated guidance and support from Josephine Dillon, a woman 17 years older than him. She took a special interest in Clark and was determined to turn him into a real actor. Josephine Dillon paid for Clark's dental work, styled his hair, trained his posture and movement, and coached his voice, all to transform the young man into a true star. And from this point on, the story of the Hollywood leading man truly began. From traveling stage to Hollywood screen. At first, Clark Gable only received supporting roles and background parts, which left him frustrated and pushed him back to the stage. The pay at that time was low, meager, and not enough to build any real status. It only helped him hold on to his dream. Disappointed with film, Clark returned to the stage. It was the most practical choice, and also the only place where he still had a chance to be recognized as a true actor. During 1927 and 1928, he joined the Laskin Brothers Stock Company in Houston. There, Clark was given more roles, performed more frequently, and honed his craft in the intense rhythm of traveling theater. This period forged him into a resilient performer who knew how to command attention. The Morning Telegraph once described him as young, energetic, and strongly masculine. It was early praise, but not enough to change his life. Then hardship struck again. In 1929 and 1930, the Great Depression swept across America, shaking the entire entertainment industry. At the same time, sound films rose to dominance, while stage theater struggled, with many productions being delayed or canceled. Clark's career fluctuated, finances were unstable, and his future seemed uncertain. At times, he nearly gave up. But in his most difficult period, Clark understood one thing clearly: if he did not adapt to the times, he would be left behind. After turning 30, fortune finally began to shift. In 1930, he signed a contract with MGM. It was not a superstar deal, but it was a ticket into the big leagues. In 1931, his villain role in The Painted Desert brought him strong attention. His pay began to improve. His name gained value, and films like A Free Soul, Her Fall and Rise Possessed, and Red Dust elevated him from a desperate struggler into one of MGM's leading male stars. However, it was not until the classic film Gone with the Wind that Clark Gable truly became a star. His role as Rhett Butler was even considered more impressive than Vivien Leigh's portrayal of Scarlett O'Hara. In fact, Gable initially refused the role because at that time he was very cautious about major characters like Rhett Butler, fearing he might disappoint audiences who already knew the character so well. Clark worried he would not fully convey it through his performance. The press at the time noted that his charm, especially his romantic gaze, was what earned him the role. He built his career with just his left eye. On the premiere day of Gone with the Wind, about 300,000 people gathered outside the theater to welcome the cast. The film won over both audiences and critics. It earned 8 Oscars out of 14 nominations, pushing his career to the peak of fame, a magnetic force for Hollywood beauties. Since signing with MGM, Clark Gable quickly became a special magnet for the studio, a man who made nearly every leading actress shine brighter beside him. He was constantly paired with top female stars like Norma Shearer, Greta Garbo, and Joan Crawford. This was not only due to his handsome looks, but also his rare presence, masculine, strong, experienced, yet soft enough to create a dangerously attractive aura. Joan Crawford once admitted that the first time she saw Clark, she felt like electricity ran through her body and her knees nearly gave out. That statement clearly explains why MGM saw him as a secret weapon. When Clark stood next to a star, the frame immediately heated up. When he appeared with Joan Crawford, they created a kind of aura, similar to what people today might compare to Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie. But from that point on, his on-screen charm began spilling into real life. A legendary love life, one of Hollywood's most notorious romantics, Clark Gable was not only famous for his career, but also for his complicated love life. Married 5 times and linked to countless affairs, Clark Gable was one of Hollywood's most notorious romantics. Besides his 5 legal wives, Gable had numerous brief relationships with some of Hollywood's most talented actresses, such as Joan Crawford, Grace Kelly, Greta Garbo, Loretta Young, Paulette Goddard, Norma Shearer. In his early struggling days, Clark Gable met actress Franz Dorfler, and the two quickly became engaged. To help her fiancé build a career, Dorfler introduced Gable to stage actress Josephine Dillon, hoping Dillon would guide him to improve quickly. However, Dorfler could not have imagined that the two, with a 17-year age gap, would develop feelings for each other. Gable broke off his engagement with Dorfler to be with Dylan, the woman who could help him become famous. Determined to support her young lover, Dylan gathered all her savings to take Gable to Hollywood in search of opportunities. At 23, Gable proposed to his teacher, and they officially became husband and wife. During this period, Gable's career was still unstable, and he only received minor roles on stage. However, with his wife's encouragement and support, Gable continued pursuing his passion. As he approached 30, Gable gained some recognition, and the young man began searching for a new place in life. Gable's second wife was Maria Rhea Langham, a wealthy woman 17 years older than him. Before meeting Gable, Langham had already been married twice and had 2 children. She fell for Gable at first sight and wanted to remarry with him. Using her financial advantage to please her lover, Langham persuaded Gable to divorce his wife and marry her. Just days after the divorce, Gable became a groom again. However, their marriage was not smooth. Over time, Gable grew distant from Langham and pursued brief affairs with younger, beautiful actresses. In his 30s, Gable's career stabilized and began to grow rapidly. At that point, he no longer needed Langham's money and sought to separate in order to legitimize his relationship with the stunning actress Carole Lombard. Carole Lombard was considered the deepest love of Clark Gable's life. They came together without calculation. Gable and Lombard met on the set of No Man of Her Own, 1932. At that time, both were already married. For nearly 7 years, the couple secretly saw each other until 1939, when they both divorced to be together openly. The time he spent with Lombard was the happiest period of Gable's life. During this time, Hollywood's Don Juan suddenly became a devoted man. His third marriage seemed like a perfect ending, but 3 years later, tragedy struck. In early 1942, Lombard suddenly died in a plane crash. Faced with this devastating loss, Clark Gable immediately enlisted in the U.S. Air Force and volunteered for the most dangerous missions. Gable served in the military for 3 years. During that time, Adolf Hitler, who admired Gable's performances, reportedly declared he would offer a large reward to anyone who captured Gable and brought him to him as long as Gable was not harmed in any way. However, Gable was never captured by enemy forces. After World War II, Gable returned to Hollywood and resumed his brief romantic affairs with actresses. In 1949, he married a widow named Sylvia Ashley, but the marriage quickly fell apart and they separated after 3 years. 3 years later, Gable married his 5th and final wife, Kay Williams, a woman who had already been married 3 times. Their marriage lasted 5 years until his death. In this marriage, Gable had his first legitimate child, a son named John Gable. Besides his son, John, Gable also had an illegitimate daughter with actress Loretta Young in 1935. To avoid scandal, Young pretended to travel to Europe to give birth in secret and later pretended to adopt her own daughter. Throughout Judy's life, Gable showed no real care except for one brief visit when he stopped by his former lover's house and spoke with Judy for a short time. Both Gable and Young never acknowledged Judy as their biological child. Later, when Judy grew up, she also never spoke about it because to her it was an insult. A fateful heart attack, and 11 days the world waited. After finishing The Misfits, Clark Gable walked off the set like a monument to Hollywood masculinity. but by then his body could no longer endure the punishing workload the way it once had. This film demanded many outdoor scenes, a long shooting schedule, and intense pressure in its final stretch. On November 6, 1960, just a few days after filming ended, Gable suffered a heart attack and was admitted to Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital. The news spread across America immediately. To the public, this was not just about the health of a famous actor, but a life and death battle involving the man once called the King of Hollywood. The next 11 days were a period when the entire film industry followed every update about him. At first, the situation did not seem too hopeless. Reports from the hospital showed signs of recovery enough for fans to hope that he would pull through, just as he had survived so many other storms in his life. The press followed every development closely, the public waited for every new update, and Hollywood was almost completely silent, listening to see whether Clark Gable could return. It was a strange kind of waiting. Not loud, not chaotic, but heavy, because everyone understood he was no longer young. This time the enemy was not box office pressure or romantic scandal, but his own heart. During those days in the hospital, Gable had moments when he was alert, talking and maintaining his familiar calm. That only made people believe even more that he would survive. But the tragedy of this death lies in the fact that it came after a stretch of silence that seemed safe. On the evening of November 16th, the situation suddenly worsened. At about 11 p.m., Clark Gable died of a second heart attack. That death did not happen on a movie set, not amid the shouting of a crowd, and not with any scandal attached to it. It happened in a hospital room quietly, quickly, and decisively. It was the kind of ending that becomes harder to accept the quieter it is. What makes this story even more cruel is the moment in which it happened. His wife, Kay Williams, was pregnant at the time. Before that, Gable had said that after finishing this film, he wanted to rest and devote time to his family. After years of moving through fame, marriage, loss, and war, he seemed to be thinking about a different rhythm of life, slower and more private. But just as that intention became clear, death cut it all short. He never got to see his son born, never got to live out the chapter he perhaps wanted most to keep for himself. That is why Clark Gable's death did not need scandal to remain haunting. It was not violent on the surface, but cruel in the way it came at the exact moment a man seemed ready to step into a calmer chapter. And what left Hollywood more silent than anything else was that even in death, Clark Gable still made one final choice that no one could take lightly. A final wish in life, a faithful man. Clark Gable was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, Glendale, beside Carole Lombard. That detail alone is enough to make the final chapter of his life one of the most lingering stories in Hollywood. Because when Gable died in 1960, the woman who was his wife was not Lombard, but Kay Williams, and Kay was pregnant with his son at the time. Yet Clark Gable's final resting place was beside the wife who had died nearly 20 years earlier. This was not just a decision about burial. It was a confirmation of which woman held the deepest place in his life. If you look back at Clark Gable's entire romantic history, this detail becomes even more striking. He went through 5 marriages, was involved with a long line of famous women, and always carried an image of irresistible attraction. Hollywood saw him as the classic bad boy, both masculine and dangerous. But behind that womanizing exterior, there seemed to be one exception, and that exception was Carol Lombard. So the question in this section is not how many women Clark Gable had in his life. The more important question is why among so many women he still returned to one name at the end of his life. Carol Lombard did not come to Gable when he had nothing. By the time they truly belonged to each other, both were already major stars. Josephine Dillon was tied to the period when he was still shaping his craft. Rhea Langham was tied to the stage when he needed status. Kay Williams was a late home, but Lombard appeared when Clark Gable already had fame, money, power, and admiration. He did not need her to rise. She did not need him to be seen. They came together in a rare state of balance. That is why their relationship is often seen as the truest emotional bond of his life. What made Lombard such a special piece of his life was not just that she was a major star. The period when Gable lived with Lombard was the most stable chapter of his private life. That man, so famous for his affairs during this period, was less drawn into the usual noise. Hollywood was full of glamorous but fragile couples, while Gable and Lombard were seen as an alliance that was both elegant and grounded. This was not called a perfect marriage, because it had no problems. It was called perfect, because in a world where almost nothing lasted, they created the strongest feeling of permanence. Then, the plane crash at the start of 1942 cut everything off. Lombard died suddenly while on her way back from a war bond tour. That death did not just take away Clark Gable's third wife. It took away the woman many believed was the center of his private world. After that loss, Gable joined the U.S. Army Air Forces. After Carol, he kept living, kept marrying, kept returning to the film set. But the story of Lombard never truly closed. That is exactly why the choice to be buried beside Lombard carries such weight. It was not a theatrical declaration of romance. It was a decision cold enough, concrete enough, and public enough that it could not be understood any other way. A man may go through many marriages, but the place he chooses to remain in after all is said and done reveals more than any interview ever could. Clark Gable was not laid to rest beside the last wife who was with him in life, but beside the woman he had lost nearly 20 years earlier. The most compelling point in this part lies in the contradiction. Clark Gable was clearly a womanizing man. He left one woman for another, had secret relationships, and left behind unfinished stories. But that same man held on to one single love that lasted until death. That does not erase the complexities of his life. So this section should not be told by idolizing him as a perfect husband. The stronger way to tell it is to preserve his contradiction. Clark Gable may have been a man who let many women enter his life, but in the end, only one woman was the one he carried with him into death. Carol Lombard, therefore, was not just a former wife. She was the part of his life he could never get back and could never replace. When you think about it, this is what makes Clark Gable's story more memorable than an ordinary romantic scandal. On the surface, he had every trait that could earn him the label of Hollywood's Don Juan. But on a deeper level, he was also a man who carried one fixed stopping place through nearly 2 final decades of his life. His final resting place confirmed that. And when a man famous for never being held down ultimately chose to lie beside one single woman, that story gains extra weight. So, after all the losses, secrets, and unfinished love, what did Clark Gable truly leave behind for the world? A hero of the battlefield. When speaking about Clark Gable's contributions, the most notable thing does not lie in charitable donations or foundations bearing his name, but in the fact that he chose direct action at the most difficult moment. In 1942, after Carol Lombard died during a war bond tour, Gable did not stand on the sidelines. He volunteered to join the U.S. Army Air Forces, stepping away from his position as a Hollywood superstar into an environment where risk was real and death was no longer a distant concept on screen. This matters because Gable did not join just to take a few promotional photos and then return. He actually flew on B-17 aircraft in 5 combat missions directly facing enemy fire. In one mission, the plane was even hit, showing that this was not a staged patriotic role, but a choice that could cost him his life. In addition, he participated in filming the war documentary Combat America, helping bring real battlefield images to the American public at a time when the country was deeply involved in a global war. Placed in that context, this was a significant form of contribution. It was not glamorous like modern charity campaigns, but it carried a different kind of weight because it was tied to duty risk and real action. Clark Gable did not build his image through widely promoted acts of kindness. He contributed in a way that closely matched who he was: quiet, decisive, and willing to step directly into the most dangerous places. A great icon of the golden age of cinema, Clark Gable was not just a major Hollywood star. He was an icon who defined how American cinema imagined the ideal man for decades. From the early 1930s until his death in 1960, Gable stood as the representative face of screen masculinity: strong, confident, experienced, slightly rebellious, but not rough, firm enough to command authority, and charming enough to win over audiences. Before Clark Gable, Hollywood had many famous actors. But after Clark Gable, the image of the leading man almost had a clear standard. It was the man who stepped into the frame and immediately made everything else fade back. What made that position endure was not just the number of successful films, but the ability to create a lasting model. Gable did not play distant, polished gentleman, nor was he the type of hero built purely on physical strength. He brought a form of masculinity that felt both relatable and irreplaceable, like a real man who had been through life, understood it, and always maintained control. That combination made him a symbol of the golden age of cinema. In an era when studios built stars like brands, Clark Gable still stood out because he did not feel like a fully polished product. He had a certain rough edge, and it was that edge that created longevity. If there is one role that defines Clark Gable's legacy, it is almost certainly Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind. This film was not only famous for its scale or revenue, but because it turned Gable into an almost irreplaceable figure in cultural memory. Rhett Butler in his hands was not just a romantic man. He was a character who was both refined and pragmatic, capable of love, yet emotionally distant, charming, yet carrying his own darkness. Many actors later could learn technique, but the presence of Clark Gable was nearly impossible to replicate. That is why his name is permanently tied to that role like a stamp. Clark Gable's influence on later generations was not limited to fame. He helped Hollywood understand that male appeal on screen did not have to come from perfect beauty. Ears once criticized a face that did not fit the conventional, smooth leading man image, and a somewhat rebellious presence, all combined into something more compelling than standard beauty ideals. Many male stars who came after, from strong leading men to charming bad boy types, followed in paths that Gable helped open. He proved that a leading man is not a perfect man, but one who makes the audience believe he can love, can fail, and still carry his own weight. Gable's legacy, therefore, is not purely bright. His image is always tied to contradiction. He was strong, yet full of cracks. He was charming, yet had a complicated personal life. He captivated millions of viewers, but could not hold on to many important things in his private life. That contradiction made the Clark Gable symbol more enduring than many idols who were only flawless on the surface. People remember him not just for his glamour, but because within that image there is always the sense of a man who truly paid a price for what he achieved. That is the difference between a famous star and a legend. His personal legacy also carries a unique tone. His son John Clark Gable was born after his death, turning his family story into a sorrowful epilogue. A man who went through 5 marriages, many relationships, and many breakups ultimately did not live to see his legitimate son born. That detail leaves his life ending with something unfinished. His fame continued to live on for a long time, but his personal life stopped at a moment when there were still things left unresolved. That is why Clark Gable's story carries a different kind of resonance compared to many icons of his time. Looking at that entire journey, it is clear he had almost everything Hollywood promises. Fame, power, wealth, beautiful women, unforgettable roles, and public adoration all once belonged to Clark Gable. But alongside that came very real losses. He lost the greatest love of his life when Carol Lombard died suddenly. He never had the chance to fully live the role of a father with the son born after his death. He also did not have enough time to resolve the secrets and unfinished parts of his private life. So when people call him the King of Hollywood, that title is both accurate and bitter. It is accurate because he truly stood at the peak of an era, but that crown could not protect him from tragedy. That is why Clark Gable is still remembered, not just as a handsome actor of the black and white film era, but as a great symbol of a golden age that has passed. He represents a time when Hollywood created legends larger than life. Yet his own life reminds us that behind that legend was always a human being filled with limits, mistakes, and loss. And when you look back at everything, the final question still carries weight. Was Clark Gable truly the King of Hollywood? Or just a man who paid too high a price to hold on to that title?
This content is for informational and entertainment purposes only. Thoughtfully compiled from public archives, historical records, and classic articles. While we strive for accuracy and balanced storytelling, some details from Hollywood's golden age remain unconfirmed and should be treated as speculative. We encourage viewers to draw their own independent conclusions. If this journey through Hollywood's shadows resonated with you, please leave a gentle like and subscribe with the bell icon so you never miss our next chapter. To continue uncovering the forgotten tragedies of the Golden Age, simply select the video on your screen right now. Thank you for keeping their memories alive.